It was the 1950s.
Sorry.
And
I know. Sorry. Before we start, I just want to say that I always enjoy your openers better than mine because they're just generally of a higher quality.
I feel like they're just two different kinds of opener. One is like the very deep dive scripted thing, and the other is a stream of consciousness thinking about a crazy thing, and they both have their place. But thank you. I'm glad you.
I do. And even just the look on your face and the way that you started there, 1950s. I knew that something of a high quality was about to occur.
Well, I hope I don't disappoint.
Come at me.
All right, I will. It was the 1950s.
It was the 1950s.
Here we go. It was the 1950s, and pathologizing of every element of women's experiences of the world was rampant. A time where if you, for some reason, weren't content to do chores and take care of children all day, then wait on your husband hand and foot when he came home, all with your hair and clothing immaculate while making sure to smell like roses and not to put on any unsightly pounds or be too skinny so that he wouldn't be grossed out when he required enthusiastic sex from you. Clearly, you were obviously crazy and needed to be put on antidepressants.
Yeah, or in the sanitarium.
Yeah, exactly. Straight up. Medicine at the time was always trying to find a way to get a woman back in the kitchen without complaint, no matter what her circumstance. And morning sickness was just one of the many afflictions a woman could suffer that instead of solving by, having her husband take on some of the duties around the house, was instead solved by medicines to keep her from skipping a day making your fried eggs. And I am being very literal about that, by the way. I'm going to send you this little 1950s advertisement real quick. And I want you to give it a look-see and say what you say.
I will. I'm eagerly awaiting it. And they would prescribe any old shit, wouldn't they? They would prescribe cocaine and amphetamines. Right,
just straight up. All of it. It's just like either sedate you or make you all hopped up or get you drunk. This is a real advertisement, Mark. You want to describe
it? All right, so you've got a lady not attired for the day yet. She's still in her morning wear, I believe. Mm-hmm. And she's got one hand on her hip and she's looking down with kind of, oh, here we fucking go again. At the what looks like a banging breakfast that she's made for her man. With the legend, now she can cook breakfast again when you prescribe new Mornidine, brand of fucking hell, Pipmazine.
Yes. And this ad, I show this to students in one of my classes, and I always ask them, because the text is so small, they can't see it from their seats. What do you think this is an ad for? And they cannot figure it out. In part because, of course, at the time, you are not supposed to show women actually pregnant. So she's just wearing kind of a puffy nightgown. You can't totally tell what's going on. And what do you mean now she can cook breakfast again? Was she injured? Was there something wrong with her? No. This is a morning sickness pill meant to make it so that you certainly didn't inconvenience your husband by not being able to get up and make breakfast. If the smell of eggs makes you sick, walk it off. Mm-hmm. Take some Mornidine, get up.
Walk it off pills.
Cook that breakfast, right? So anyway, don't get me wrong, though. Morning sickness apparently blows. And of course, women desperately wanted an effective treatment for it. As a person whose response to any negative stimulus is to throw up, I can only imagine that feeling nauseated for days, weeks, or months at a time with little reprieve must be a special kind of hell.
Yeah, I know personally ladies who've had, I think it's hyperemesis, I think is the term.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
It ain't just morning sickness,
right.
It's a constant debilitating, vomiting nausea.
Yes.
That turns, what ought to be a happy and forward-facing time of your life into a fucking horrific ordeal. Hospitalization, worries about the kind of the viability of the pregnancy, relationships,
bed rest,
trauma. Yeah, exactly. It turns you essentially into an invalid for the entire time you've got it.
Yeah, exactly. And so, pregnant women can't be blamed for their enthusiasm to try out a new drug that might help them with this. And this particular new drug at this time is manufactured in Germany in the late 1950s, called by many different brand names around the world. That drug was thalidomide.
Ah, fuck, I was hoping you wouldn't say that.
It's thalidomide, yes. Thalidomide was the product of a cosmetics company that had recently branched into pharmaceuticals called CoRri Grunenthal.
Is that what Mornidine is, thalidomide?
No. Mornidine isn't thalidomide. That's separate. But and there's a reason for that. You'll see why, because that ad was an American ad. But so this was, like I said, a cosmetics company. And they made like facial soap before this and decided to get into pharmaceuticals. And thalidomide was considered to be an absolute wonder drug, because when put through animal testing trials, there seemed to be literally no dose you could give to a rat that would kill it. You could just give it more and more and more, and it would not die. So it seemed exceedingly safe for use and seemingly had a variety of uses. At the time, barbiturate overdoses and deaths were super high. So finding that thalidomide was a guaranteed non-lethal sedative was a huge draw. It was also used for symptoms of colds and flu, and could be purchased over the counter. It didn't require a prescription. And it became so popular, its sales were equivalent to the sales of aspirin in some markets.
Fucking hell.
Yeah. And it soon became apparent that thalidomide could be used for the treatment of nausea, which meant finally women could have access to a 100% safe cure for their morning sickness. An absolute miracle drug.
Breakfast all round. Breakfast back on the menu,
for
boys.
Everybody. There it is. As you can imagine, though, Mark, things were not as they seemed.
Nope.
In fact, people who were using thalidomide as a sedative, mostly elderly people, were starting to experience some very serious side effects, namely sensory peripheral neuropathy in the nerves to their hands and feet, which is essentially like numbness and tingling.
Yeah, sure.
In these areas. And it wasn't just a temporary hiccup while they were taking the medicine. It left people permanently disabled. And of course, CoRri Grunenthal denied any connection to their drug, and they settled the complaints out of court. The German government quietly made the medicine prescription only, and of course, sales started to slump. But this happened to coincide when they realized they could push this to have it prescribed to pregnant women, not only in Germany, but also abroad. A Scottish whiskey distiller seeking to diversify their holdings and branch into pharmaceuticals due to high taxes and alcohol in post-war Britain secured the rights to sell thalidomide in the British Commonwealth. And being just as inexperienced in the world of pharma as CoRri Grunenthal, because it's a whiskey distiller.
Yeah, sure. Soap and whiskey with these two.
Soap and whiskey, yeah. They just kind of assumed that the makers had done the proper research and testing and that the medicine was perfectly safe. All told, thalidomide was sold as a morning sickness cure under 40 different brand names around the world. It was not, however, approved by the FDA in America, as medical officer Dr. Frances Kelsey insisted she had not seen enough evidence of its rigorous testing, even after CoRri Grunenthal sent in all kinds of what they considered proof and applied immense pressure to her to, just to prove it. So thanks to Dr. Kelsey, likely tens of thousands of babies in the United States were spared death and deformity from thalidomide. But here's what happened elsewhere. Some 10 to 15,000 children suffered the effects of their mothers using thalidomide in the early days of pregnancy. And it's hard to get a fully accurate picture of how many it was, because it's estimated that between 40 to 50% of babies poisoned by thalidomide died within days of birth, and even more likely died in the womb before any cause of death could be attributed to them, especially before it was known that thalidomide had dire effects. Children that didn't die experienced a range of disabilities and deformities, including being born with holes in organs or without certain organs at all, damage to or missing eyes and ears, and most commonly, what's called phocomelia, or malformation of the limbs. So people with phocomelia essentially have shortened arms and legs that look almost like flippers. If you've ever watched the freak show season of American Horror Story, that super hot guy with the short arms, Matt Fraser, he was born with phocomelia from thalidomide. I'm going to send you some photos now just for reference. And I will also pop these up on our Instagram for anyone who might be interested in looking at them later. And if you want to describe again what you see there.
All I'm seeing is essentially what you've already described, although what looked like some very impractical and quite cruel looking prosthetic devices attached to one of these poor kids who looks to me to be on the verge of tears while trying to navigate very sad picture while trying to navigate a what's the word, almost it looks like some kind of contraption which they've strapped her into to give her the appearance of, you know, quote unquote normal arms.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of, I mean, you can look at the various forms of prosthetics that they attempted to make for these kids to give them some semblance of normal life. But honestly, that's the best case scenario for a lot of them. Parents did not. Oh, go ahead.
That's certainly an episode that I'd like to return to.
Prosthetics,
the history and innovation in the prosthetics realm.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. But yeah, parents did not react super well to bearing children with these disabilities.
No.
And many of these kids were straight up just abandoned and institutionalized, sent to homes where they'd never see their families again. And at least one mother and her doctor went so far as to murder a deformed infant in what they considered a mercy killing. And
yeah, that was one of the things I was about to kind of ask, really. I mean, that's surely got to be one of the reasons why true figures are impossible to come by, because how many of these, you know, were
murdered,
like you said yourself, murdered, mercy.
That's exactly what I was about to say. Yeah, that that's another part of the difficulty in estimating this, is they don't know how many of these kids were just killed as soon as they were born. So yeah, just not a great time to be born with some form of disability like that. And naturally, at first, it was hard to trace exactly why this was happening to these kids, but soon some patterns began to arise. According to Dr. Janet McCready, one of the major patterns was geographical.
Right.
Quote, West Germany had thousands of deformed babies, while East Germany had none. They simply stopped at the Iron Curtain. That's
wow.
Yeah, right. Canada had over 150. The US, almost none. They stopped at the 49th parallel. Britain had over 400 cases, and the British Commonwealth was afflicted. For example, Australia had 46 known cases. So doctors began searching for the cause of this phenomenon. One of them, Dr. Videkund Lenz, a Hamburg pediatrician, found that 41 out of 46 mothers of phocomelic babies had taken a thalidomide preparation in early pregnancy.
One of the most inspirational people I've ever fucking met in my life. And I only knew this guy for like 3 or 4 days. Not linked to thalidomide, but I was doing some work up in Scotland. And one of the lads in this class that I was working with had phocomelia. Badly kind of misshapen or kind of, you know, like you said, arms.
Yeah.
But this fucking guy worked every single day of his life. Was apparently a shit hot FIFA player with his feet.
Yeah.
And just had nothing but spirit and yeah, just a truly lovely guy.
Yeah, and a lot of the people who have phocomelia from thalidomide have done incredible things and whatnot. And you know, not to make a disability inspiration porn out
certainly
of it,
not.
But
No.
It there's a lot of images and stuff like that you can see of people who manage to, having grown up their entire lives like this, come up with incredible other ways to use their limbs and whatnot. And of course, it depends on what kind of, you know, advantages you had too. Like if you were one of those kids left in an institution somewhere, probably a lot harder to overcome a lot of this stuff. But
yeah, sure.
You see people who their parents were really there for them, or like, all right, we're going to support our way through this, figure this out. And they've been able to do a lot of really great things. But where was I? I'll find myself there. Oh, but yeah. Okay. But soon after those findings that the 41 out of 46 mothers of these babies had used thalidomide, this was October of 1961. An Australian obstetrician named Dr. William McBride wrote into the Lancet in November saying that he had observed the same patterns in his own clients. So the drug was withdrawn pretty much immediately. And lo and behold, 8 months later, the Phocomelia epidemic abruptly stopped. That was it. That this horrifying epidemic had happened in the first place led to a wave of new restrictions and guidelines worldwide about pharmaceutical testing and regulation, essentially creating the bulk of the safety rules we use to this very day in most countries, especially Western countries. A major one of those is that medicine can't be solely tested on animals. You have to prove it's actually safe for people before you feed it to them. Yeah. And that was one of the big things that happened here was, yeah, they proved that it was great for rats. It was fine, but it did not translate over to humans the same way. But there is a plot twist here. It turns out that thalidomide was only harmful in pregnancy to a fetus in about the first 42 days of pregnancy, a thing that scientists have actually only fully understood for a few years now, and which I'm not actually going to explain, but you can find out more about it in my references on the blog on jackofallgraves.com. Moreover, though, there are actually various uses for the drug now. As one doctor put it in a New York Times piece, thalidomide... So it's still in use.
It's still in use.
It's still in use, yes. To say still in use makes it sound like it was in use all of that time. It wasn't. I mean, it still is, unfortunately, in some sort of developing nations and things like that. It never completely discontinued, and they still face problems with this. But in terms of actually being used for morning sickness and having these problems with the thalidomide babies in most countries, that's not a thing anymore. But decades later, they discovered there might be some uses. So as I was saying, that was a drug in search of a disease, right? This doctor was saying that when something is that powerful in its effects, there probably is some use for it. It was a bad idea for that particular thing, but it can probably tackle something else. And the issue is figuring out what, and are the risks worth it? So today, doctors have essentially by accident found that thalidomide can be used as treatments for things like the cancer, multiple myeloma, and for leprosy. While leprosy can't be cured, thalidomide was found to literally remove all the symptoms while it's actively being taken. Okay. Which is pretty wild. So it's hard to call it a win, per se, with tens of thousands of children harmed or killed in the few short years it was marketed. And it really was a few years. We're talking about 3 years on the market, I think, that it did all that damage. And further, while the Scottish whiskey distillery was forced to pay out a princely sum in perpetuity by those harmed by their product in Britain and were forced out of the pharma biz forever, Kemi Grunenthal was never criminally charged and didn't even formally apologize for what they'd done until 2012. They're now still in the business of making drugs meant to alleviate chronic pain.
Sorry, not only are they still in business,
they still make drugs for pain. That's their big thing. Okay. Is alleviating chronic pain.
That's wild to me.
Yeah, it really is. It's totally insane that that's a thing. But as we say, life finds a fucking way, mate. And at least there are some folks out there benefiting from the effects of this otherwise devastating drug.